In June of 2022, US inflation hit 9.1%, the highest reading in roughly 40 years. Gas prices crossed $5 a gallon on average across California. Egg prices later doubled during the 2022 to 2023 avian flu shock. The Federal Reserve, which spent a decade insisting inflation was transitory, started raising rates at the fastest pace since the early 1980s. And somewhere in a Princeton archive, a stack of yellowed memos from 1973 suddenly read like they were written last Tuesday. That's not the first time a developed economy has woken up to find the rules had changed overnight. And we already know how the story ends. History doesn't repeat, it patterns. This one is called the stagflation spiral. Once an economy locks in structural inflation while growth stalls, escape requires breaking something, and someone always pays the bill. Start with August 15th, 1971. Richard Nixon goes on television on a Sunday night and tells Americans that the dollar will no longer be convertible into gold for foreign governments. The Bretton Woods system, in place since 1944, effectively ends in a single broadcast. The same speech announces a 90-day freeze on most wages and prices in the United States. Economists at the time call it bold. They will spend the next decade calling it something else. 2 years later, October 1973. Egypt and Syria attack Israel on Yom Kippur. The United States resupplies the Israeli military. Arab members of OPEC respond with an oil embargo against the United States and several allies. The price of crude roughly quadruples over the following months, from around $3 a barrel to about $12. Gas stations in New Jersey ration fuel by license plate number. The Dow loses roughly 45% of its value between January 1973 and December 1974. But the pattern didn't stop there. January 1979. The Shah of Iran flees Tehran. Iranian oil production collapses. Crude roughly doubles again over the following year, eventually reaching the high 30s per barrel. American inflation, which had briefly cooled, surges back above 13% by 1980. 2 oil shocks in 6 years. A currency cut loose from gold. And underneath all of it, a fiscal wound from Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson's guns and butter policy, with direct war costs estimated at over $100 billion in then-current dollars, layered on top of new social spending and locking in deficits the system struggled to absorb. Now, go back 400 years. Spain, 16th century. Silver pours in from Potosi and Zacatecas across decades of colonial extraction. Prices in Castile rise an estimated 300 to 400% across the century, what historians call the price revolution. Wages don't keep up. Spanish manufacturing erodes because imports become cheaper. The Spanish crown defaults on its debt multiple times under Philip II, an empire drowning in its own money supply, watching its productive base hollow out. The Spanish called it nothing in particular. They just lived through it. Go back further. Rome, the 3rd century. The silver denarius, which began under Augustus as around 95% silver, gets shaved and debased emperor by emperor. By the reign of Gallienus, around 260 AD, the standard silver coin in circulation contains only a few percent silver. Soldiers grow reluctant to accept it. Tax collectors increasingly demand payment in kind, grain, oil, cloth. Diocletian issues the edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, a sweeping wage and price freeze across the empire, with severe penalties including death for violations. It fails within a few years. Goods disappear from official markets. Black markets flourish. 3 civilizations. 3 currencies untethered from discipline. 3 governments reaching for price controls. 3 economies that stagnated while prices kept climbing. The faces change. The mechanism doesn't. Stagflation isn't supposed to exist. The textbook said inflation comes from an overheating economy and recession comes from a cooling one. You shouldn't get both at the same time. For roughly 25 years after World War II, mainstream Keynesian economics treated this as nearly settled. Then 1973 happened, and the textbooks had to be rewritten. Here's what's actually going on underneath. An economy has two sides. A demand side, how much money is chasing goods, and a supply side, how much the economy can actually produce. Most inflation is a demand problem. Too much money, not enough stuff. Prices rise, central banks raise rates, demand cools, prices stabilize. Clean. Stagflation breaks this loop because the shock hits the supply side. An oil embargo doesn't make people want less gasoline. It makes gasoline physically scarce. A war doesn't reduce demand for wheat. It removes Ukrainian wheat from the market. When the supply curve shifts, raising rates doesn't fix the shortage. It just adds a recession on top of the inflation. Now, layer in the second mechanism, expectations. Once workers believe prices will keep rising, they demand higher wages. Once businesses believe wages will keep rising, they raise prices preemptively. The spiral becomes self-reinforcing. Inflation today causes inflation tomorrow because everyone is pricing it in. Economists call this unanchored inflation expectations. In plain English, nobody trusts the money anymore. And here's the trap. The only proven cure is brutal. You have to break expectations by inducing a recession deep enough that workers stop demanding raises and businesses stop raising prices. You have to make people more afraid of unemployment than of inflation. That's not a policy choice. That's a political nightmare, which is exactly why every government tries the easy way first. Wage controls, price freezes, subsidies, jawboning, blaming speculators. None of it works because none of it addresses the underlying supply constraint or the expectations problem. It just delays the reckoning and usually makes it worse. The pattern requires pain to break, and democracies hate pain. Watch what's happening right now. Energy. The transition away from fossil fuels has constrained investment in new oil and gas capacity for nearly a decade. As of early 2026, global spare capacity remains historically tight. Brent crude has repeatedly traded above $90 a barrel across the post-pandemic period. Europe spent 2022 paying spot prices for natural gas that were, at peak, several times the pre-2021 average. That's a supply shock dressed in green clothes. Globalization. From roughly 1990 to 2015, China added hundreds of millions of workers to the global labor pool. That was one of the largest deflationary forces in modern economic history. It is now reversing. Tariffs between the United States and China have stayed elevated through multiple administrations. Reshoring announcements from semiconductor firms, battery makers, and pharmaceutical companies suggest a structural shift. Cheaper labor is no longer a one-way bet. Demographics. Japan's working-age population peaked in the mid-1990s. China's peaked around the mid-2010s. Germany, Italy, South Korea, the same trajectory. The United States is aging more slowly, but workforce participation among prime-age men has not fully recovered to its late 20th century levels. Fewer workers means upward pressure on wages, regardless of central bank policy. Fiscal dominance. This is the part nobody wants to say out loud. When Paul Volcker raised the federal funds rate to a peak of around 20% in 1981, U.S. federal debt held by the public was around 30% of GDP. Today, that ratio sits near 100%, and gross federal debt exceeds 120% of GDP. Every percentage point of higher interest rates now costs the Treasury hundreds of billions of dollars in additional annual interest. At some point, the math pressures the central bank to back off, not because inflation is beaten, but because the fiscal cost becomes politically unbearable. And underneath all of it, the productivity wildcard. Artificial intelligence is the one variable that could break the pattern in the other direction. If large language models and automation deliver a genuine productivity boom, say sustained gains across a decade, That would be a deflationary force comparable to China's entry into the global economy. Hyperscalers including Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Meta have collectively committed hundreds of billions of dollars to AI infrastructure across 2024 and 2025, according to public capital expenditure guidance. Whether that capital produces real output gains or just inflated valuations is the open question of the decade. The ingredients are assembling. The only thing missing is the moment everyone agrees to call it by its name. Can the pattern be broken? Honestly, sometimes, but rarely on purpose. The Volcker exit worked, but not for the reason most people remember. Yes, he pushed rates near 20%. Yes, unemployment hit 10.8% in late 1982. But several other things happened simultaneously. North Sea and Alaskan oil came online through the late 1970s and early 1980s, eroding OPEC's pricing power. Reagan fired the striking PATCO air traffic controllers in 1981, signaling the end of organized labor's bargaining strength. Trucking and airlines had been deregulated under Carter in 1978 and 1980, slashing logistics costs. And starting in 1978, Deng Xiaoping began opening China to reform, beginning what would become one of the largest labor supply shocks in history. Volcker got the credit. He had help. The cases where empires escaped without help are almost non-existent. Rome never escaped, it transformed into something else. Spain didn't escape, it declined for 2 centuries. Britain in the 1970s only stabilized after Thatcher imposed a deep recession and rode North Sea oil revenues into the 1980s. The honest answer: the pattern can be broken, but it requires either a technological windfall, a new cheap labor frontier, a willingness to absorb a deep recession, or some combination. Pick none of those and you don't escape the spiral. You just live inside it longer. Pattern confirmed. The stagflation spiral doesn't end when policymakers decide it should. It ends when the structural conditions change, with or without permission. Now I want your take. Do you think this same pattern is unfolding today, or is this time truly different? Tell me your perspective in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.